In October of 1881, a brief notice appeared in the New York Tribune announcing that architect Richard Morris Hunt had accepted a commission of unusual scale on Fifth Avenue. The building it described would stretch 137 feet along the street, its carved limestone facade rising in tiers of corbelled cornices and rusticated stone. Each block imported, each decorative element personally approved before setting. Workers arrived the following spring, 600 of them at peak construction, laying the foundations of what William Henry Vanderbilt intended as the defining residential statement of his era. The mansion rose over 2 years of relentless labor, was received by the press as an American palace without precedent, and stood for fewer than 4 decades before the wrecking crews arrived in 1914. What the stone declared, time quietly overruled. There is a moment in every city's history when a single street becomes something more than a collection of addresses. Fifth Avenue in the 1870s was undergoing exactly that transformation. Not gradually, not accidentally, but through a series of deliberate architectural decisions made by men who understood that where you lived announced, more precisely than any spoken claim, exactly who you were and exactly who you were not. The mansions rising along the corridor between 50th and 72nd Streets were not expressions of simple comfort. They were territorial declarations, each one occupying its lot with the calculated aggression of a feudal fortification. Rusticated brownstone bases gave the facades an intentional weight, communicating permanence through sheer material mass. Wrought iron gates, some reaching 15 feet in height, marked the boundary between the public sidewalk and the private world within. Carriage courts tucked behind stone walls assured that even the domestic rituals of arrival and departure were conducted away from public scrutiny. William Henry Vanderbilt commissioned his double mansion at 640 Fifth Avenue with a clarity of purpose that bordered on philosophical. The project was not about housing. He was already housed, comfortably, in a manner that would have satisfied any reasonable measure of domestic need. The project was about separation. It was about the construction of a visible boundary between a man who had inherited and then vastly multiplied one of the largest fortunes in American history and the ordinary city pressing in around him on all sides. When Harper's Weekly surveyed the finished block in 1883, its correspondent described the effect as a palace row unprecedented in the Democratic Republic, a phrase that captured both the architectural achievement and the ideological tension embedded in it. A democratic republic was, by definition, hostile to the logic of palaces, and yet here they stood, undeniable in their limestone mass, daring the republic to object. The intellectual framework for this kind of building had not emerged from American tradition. It had been imported, quite deliberately, from the European grand tour that the Vanderbilt and Astor generations treated as a mandatory education in cultural ambition. They had walked through the chateaux of the Loire Valley, stood in the forecourts of French hotels particuliers, examined the proportional systems of Florentine palazzi, and returned to New York with a conviction that what European aristocracy had built over centuries of inherited privilege could be compressed, purchased, and erected in a matter of years by men with sufficient capital and sufficient will. The aesthetic consequences were visible in every design choice. The chateau-inspired roof lines, the Renaissance revival ornamental programs, the deliberate asymmetries borrowed from English manor house traditions. What the Europeans had arrived at through slow accumulation, the Americans achieved through the brute application of money to architecture. Richard Morris Hunt was the instrument through whom this cultural ambition was translated into stone. He was the first American architect to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and he returned to New York carrying not just technical training, but an entire theory of what monumental architecture could accomplish for a client who needed the world to perceive him as legitimate. Hunt understood, perhaps more clearly than his clients initially did, that architecture at this scale was not design in any conventional sense. It was the manufacture of historical gravity. The buildings he produced for the Vanderbilt family along Fifth Avenue and later in Newport were engineered to feel old the moment they were finished, to project the suggestion of generations in their massing and their detail, to make new money feel, at least to the eye of a passing stranger, like the natural residue of an ancient line. The private mansion occupied an entire city block. Within 30 years, every one of them was gone. Hunt maintained his professional offices on Washington Place, and the correspondence that passed through them during the 1880s constitutes one of the more revealing archives of Gilded Age cultural ambition. The surviving design sketches for Marble House in Newport, now preserved in the collection of the Preservation Society of Newport County, show a project that underwent significant revision not at the initiative of the architect, but at the insistence of his client. Alva Vanderbilt, who commissioned Marble House as a wedding gift from her husband William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1892, approached the design process with an authority that was unusual for the era and slightly alarming to Hunt's professional instincts. She had specific requirements. She wanted the entrance hall to be sheathed in sienna marble columns. She wanted gilded bronze railings on the principal staircase. She wanted the overall material program to consume, in her own estimation, more marble than had been used in any private American building since the country's founding. The finished structure used approximately 500,000 cubic feet of marble, at a total cost that translates to roughly $11 million in contemporary value. Hunt delivered it. He delivered it because his professional role, as he understood it, was not to restrain his client's ambitions, but to give those ambitions a formal coherence that would survive critical scrutiny. The architect's true function in the Gilded Age was translation, taking the raw energy of accumulated wealth and rendering it in the vocabulary of European high culture, stripping away the commercial origins of the fortune and replacing them with the visual grammar of aristocratic legitimacy. To achieve this, Hunt needed to understand his clients not as patrons in the traditional sense, but as collaborators in a project of cultural reinvention. Stanford White, and working with his partners Charles McKim and William Meade, operated from the same professional philosophy but with a somewhat different aesthetic temperament. Where Hunt tended toward French academic formalism, White brought an Italian Renaissance sensibility that expressed itself in richer surfaces, more aggressive ornamental programs, and a particular genius for the manipulation of interior space to create theatrical effects. The houses White designed in Newport and on Long Island during the 1880s and 90s used the staircase as their primary compositional device, a grand ascent visible from the entrance door, drawing the visitor upward through a sequence of spaces that crescendoed at the principal reception rooms. The staircase was never purely functional. It was performance infrastructure engineered to make the act of arriving feel ceremonial. Alva Vanderbilt's direct intervention in the Marble House design extended to details that Hunt might have resolved differently without her presence. The proportions of the entrance hall columns were adjusted 3 times before she approved them. The color selection for the gilded bronze railings required samples sent from Paris foundries. Her involvement transformed the collaboration from a professional commission into something closer to a creative partnership, with Alva supplying the cultural ambition and Hunt supplying the technical means to realize it. The result was a building that felt more European than most European buildings, more deliberately, more consciously aristocratic than anything built by actual aristocrats, because actual aristocrats did not need to prove anything, and Alva Vanderbilt very much did. Hunt billed $11 million in today's equivalent for Marble House. Alva Vanderbilt reportedly said it was worth every cent to silence her critics. In 1884, a residential building opened on the west side of Central Park that was designed by every conventional measure to represent the apex of apartment living in New York. The Dakota building offered suites of 7 to 9 rooms, private dining facilities, a central courtyard, and service arrangements that its developer Edward Clark promoted as equivalent to those available in any private mansion. Clark was not a naive man. He understood the market he was addressing, and he understood that the upper tiers of New York society maintained strong opinions about domestic space and its relationship to social identity. What he may have underestimated was the depth of cultural resistance that his building would encounter among the very class he hoped to attract. No matter how generously the suites were proportioned, no matter how carefully the service was arranged, the Dakota was an apartment building. Its walls were shared. Its staircases were common. Its address was held in common by everyone who paid rent within it. Ward McAllister, whose position as arbiter of New York's social life was formalized in his role organizing Mrs. Astor's celebrated guest lists, addressed the question of domestic space directly in his 1890 memoir, Society as I Have Found It. McAllister was systematic about the relationship between architecture and social standing. He understood and made explicit in his writing that a man's domestic arrangements were not merely personal choices, but public statements requiring interpretation by the society that observed them. The private ballroom was not a luxury. It was a functional necessity for anyone who expected to participate in the social calendar at any meaningful level. Dinners for 200 guests required dining rooms that no apartment building could provide. Debutante presentations required grand halls with staircases along which young women could make their ceremonial descent. Charity receptions required the kind of flexible space, moving from drawing room to conservatory to ballroom, that only a purpose-built private mansion could offer. The mathematics of social entertaining in the Gilded Age made apartment living functionally impossible at the highest levels of society, entirely apart from the symbolic objections. The household of a family operating at the level of the Vanderbilts or the Astors required dedicated servants' quarters for a staff that numbered in the dozens during the New York season. It required a butler's pantry adjacent to the formal dining room, a flower room for daily arrangements, a silver vault, a wine cellar of significant capacity, a housekeeper's suite, a kitchen staffed by a French chef and multiple assistants, and rooms for the ladies' maids and valets who traveled with family members. None of this infrastructure existed in any apartment building, however generously appointed. The private mansion was not chosen over the apartment building because of snobbery alone. It was chosen because, for the social and operational requirements of Gilded Age elite life, the private mansion was the only structure that actually worked. The objection to shared walls was real, but it was not primarily aesthetic. It was social philosophical. Shared walls implied proximity. Proximity implied a degree of equality between neighbors. The same address, the same building, the same entrance. In a social system whose entire logic depended on maintaining and enforcing distinctions, this implied equality was intolerable. Society columns in private circulation during the 1890s referred to even the most luxurious apartment buildings as, at best, genteel boarding houses. The phrase stung precisely because it was understood by everyone who read it. On the evening of March 26, 1883, 675 guests arrived at 665th Avenue, dressed as figures from French royal courts, Venetian carnivals, and ancient mythologies. They came not merely to celebrate a new house, they came because they had no choice. Alva Vanderbilt had engineered the situation with the precision of a military campaign, and the architectural theater she had commissioned from Richard Morris Hunt was the battlefield on which old New York's social hierarchy would be permanently rearranged. The ball was the housewarming for the completed Vanderbilt mansion, and its central drama had nothing to do with costumes or champagne. It had everything to do with the staircase. Alva had designed an entertainment called the Star Quadrille, a choreographed dance requiring specific invited participants who needed weeks of rehearsal. Among those selected was Carrie Astor, daughter of Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the uncontested queen of New York society. Carrie desperately wanted to participate, but her mother had never formally called upon Alva Vanderbilt, a social obligation that, if unmet, meant the entire Vanderbilt family remained outside the charmed circle Mrs. Astor controlled. Without a formal call, there could be no invitation. Without an invitation, Carrie could not rehearse. Without rehearsal, Carrie could not dance. Mrs. Astor called. The card was left. The invitation was issued, and on the night of the ball, Carrie Astor and her mother descended a grand staircase that was, in every carved detail, a monument to the social victory their appearance represented. The New York Times devoted 3 full columns to the event the following morning, cataloging costumes, describing the dining arrangements, noting the floral installations, white roses banked against the staircase rails, hothouse orchids imported from a Long Island greenhouse. But the architectural substance of the evening was unmistakable even through the breathless prose. Alva Vanderbilt had used stone, mortar, gilded plaster, and approximately $3 million to force the most powerful woman in American society to climb her stairs. The private ballroom at the Vanderbilt mansion measured approximately 40 by 60 feet, with a ceiling height sufficient to accommodate the elaborate gas chandelier installation that illuminated the space. In a warm golden wash, deliberately evocative of a European opera house. The room was not incidentally large. Its dimensions were calculated to a social science. Ward McAllister, Alva's sometime collaborator and the self-appointed arbiter of the 400, the mythologized guest list of those who truly mattered in New York, had established through years of observation that a truly significant ball required space for no fewer than 500 guests without crowding, and that crowding, the physical press of bodies against one another, destroyed the essential spatial grammar of social hierarchy. Distance was dignity. Proximity was commerce. Every architectural decision in the mansion served this social logic. The staircase was wide enough that 2 women in elaborate bustled gowns could descend simultaneously without their skirts touching. A seemingly minor point that was in practice the difference between a graceful entrance and an awkward one, between a moment of social theater and a moment of social embarrassment. The ceiling height in the entrance hall was calculated not for comfort, but for the visual drama of arrival, the sensation that one had entered a space larger and more consequential than the street outside. The marble floors were selected for their acoustic properties. The sound of footsteps on stone communicated seriousness, permanence, and weight in ways that carpet or wood simply could not. The Astor family's existing mansion, a relatively modest brownstone on Fifth Avenue, possessed no ballroom capable of hosting the season's major entertainments. Mrs. Astor hosted her famous gatherings in a double parlor that could accommodate roughly 400 guests if the furniture was removed. The physical origin, some historians suggest, of McAllister's 400 figure. But Alva's new structure rendered this arrangement visibly inadequate, and the social message embedded in the comparison was clear to every person who attended both establishments. Architecture had delivered a verdict that social maneuvering had been unable to reach. The ballroom was not a room. It was a ruling. The Indiana limestone that forms Biltmore's exterior walls was quarried, cut, and transported by a private railroad spur that George Washington Vanderbilt II had constructed specifically for the purpose. The spur connected the construction site near Asheville, North Carolina, to the main line of the Western North Carolina Railroad, and over the course of the estate's 6-year construction period, it carried an estimated volume of raw material sufficient to build a small city. This was not unusual for major Gilded Age construction projects. What was unusual was the philosophical clarity with which Vanderbilt and his architect Richard Morris Hunt understood what all this imported material was actually importing. European stone was European time. When Hunt specified that Biltmore's great banquet hall would be modeled on the medieval great halls of English and French chateaux, and that its 65-foot ceiling would be supported by structural systems derived from centuries of Gothic engineering refinement, he was making a claim on behalf of his client that no amount of cash could directly purchase. American wealth was new. It lacked the patina of generations, the accumulated gravity of inherited land and ancestral portraits. Stone from French quarries carried, in the imagination of the Gilded Age elite, the Yanzabi and Arpain was the weight of the civilization that had shaped it. To build in that stone was to borrow that weight, to graft an ancient material onto a young family name and hope the association would hold. Vanderbilt's European education made this logic feel personal rather than merely social. He had traveled extensively on the continent, studied art history with a seriousness unusual among his peers, and assembled a collection of paintings, tapestries, and decorative objects that reflected genuine connoisseurship rather than the simple accumulation of expensive things. When he instructed Hunt that Biltmore should function as a private museum as much as a private residence, he meant it architecturally as well as institutionally. The library, which holds more than 22,000 volumes, was designed with ceiling height and natural light appropriate to scholarship. The tapestry gallery was proportioned to display Flemish tapestries at the viewing distances their scale required. These were not decorative decisions. They were spatial arguments about what kind of person lived here and what relationship that person had with the cultural inheritance of Western civilization. Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed the 8,000-acre estate grounds, understood the landscape dimension of this argument with equal sophistication. His correspondence with Vanderbilt, portions of which survive in the Library of Congress, reveals a sustained negotiation between Olmsted's ecological philosophy and Vanderbilt's social ambitions. Olmsted favored naturalistic plantings, managed forests, and a working agricultural component that would make the estate economically productive as well as beautiful. Vanderbilt accepted these constraints but insisted on formal approach roads, managed vistas, and a 3-mile entrance drive specifically designed to produce a progressive revelation of the house. A choreographed arrival experience that controlled the visitor's perception of the estate's scale and, by extension, of its owner's significance. The triple fireplace in the banquet hall, 3 separate fireboxes set into a single monumental chimney breast 60 feet wide, was perhaps the most explicit material statement in the entire building. No practical heating calculation required 3 fireplaces in a single room. The triple configuration existed to communicate excess of a specific and deliberate kind, the excess of a man who had considered every option available and chosen the most emphatic one. Each fireplace surround was carved from a different stone, limestone, sandstone, and marble, in a sequence that moved from the utilitarian to the precious as the eye traveled upward, geology as biography. The stone at the base was the stone of the region, the American earth. The marble at the crown was imported, European, ancient. The chimney breast was, in miniature, the chimney breast to Jamfarasti Meditanit, the story of what Biltmore was built to tell, that the Vanderbilt family had arrived at the level of civilization where the finest materials the world produced were simply what they used. The basement level of the breakers in Newport, Rhode Island contains systems that most visitors never see, and that the 1895 house guides never mention to guests. A complete refrigeration plant, a dedicated electrical generation facility, a laundry operation equipped with industrial-scale equipment, a kitchen complex with separate stations for roasting, pastry, sauce preparation, and cold work. Beneath the celebrated Italian Renaissance exterior, beneath the marble floors and the gilded ceilings and the loggia open to Narragansett Bay, there operated a private institution of considerable organizational complexity, one that required, in a typical Newport season, a permanent staff of approximately 40 indoor servants supplemented by seasonal hires that brought the total household workforce to a number exceeding that of many American hotels of the same period. This was not an anomaly. It was the operational reality of Gilded Age mansion life at its upper reaches, and it explains an architectural feature that is easy to overlook: the parallel circulation system built into virtually every major estate of the era. The breakers contains two entirely separate systems of corridors and staircases. One for family and guests, one for servants. The servant system runs through the building at a slight remove from the primary spaces, connecting basement service areas to upper floor bedrooms through passages that were designed to be functionally efficient and visually invisible. A guest descending the grand staircase to dinner would never encounter a servant carrying a chamber pot or a basket of pressed linens. The house had been architecturally engineered so that the labor sustaining its beauty would never contaminate the experience of that beauty. The head butler at a major Gilded Age Newport estate managed a household that functioned, in organizational terms, more like a hotel department structure than anything a modern reader would recognize as domestic. Under his authority sat the housekeeper, who supervised the female indoor staff, the chef, who commanded the kitchen hierarchy independently and reported both to the butler and directly to the mistress of the house on menu questions, the head footman, who managed the table service staff, the ladies' maids assigned to the mistress and any resident female guests, and the valets assigned to the master and male guests. Each layer of this hierarchy had its own customs, its own table in the servants' dining room, and its own set of rules governing interaction with the layers above and below. Alva Vanderbilt's household management records, portions of which survive in family papers, document the administrative infrastructure required to operate one of the major Newport cottages during the season. Provisioning for a single dinner party of 50 guests required coordination across multiple vendors, advanced preparation extending several days, and a deployment of serving staff calibrated to the number of courses and the social rank of the guests. More footmen per table for a dinner with titled European visitors. A different wine service protocol for evenings when the host wished to display a particular cellar acquisition. The mansion was not simply a setting for these events, it was a machine for producing them, and its scale was determined as much by operational requirements as by aesthetic ambition. The architects understood this. Hunt's floor plans for major Newport commissions show the service wing given as much detailed attention as the public rooms, with sightline studies ensuring that service corridors would remain invisible from primary entertaining spaces, and with acoustic considerations built into the partition walls between family areas and servant quarters. Stanford White's work at Rosecliff, completed in 1902, incorporated a kitchen placement in a detached dependency connected by a covered passage that kept cooking odors entirely separated from the main house while maintaining the service speed required for formal dining. These were not luxury features. They were the minimum technical specifications for a building intended to function as its owners required. The beauty of the mansions depended absolutely on the operational excellence of their invisible infrastructure, and the invisible infrastructure required physical space on an institutional scale. The mansion kept growing not because taste demanded it, but because the machine kept requiring more room. The fountain at the center of Biltmore's garden axis sits at the precise intersection of two lines, one running from the primary entrance of the house, one running perpendicular to the first along the formal garden's central alley. This placement is not accidental. Frederick Law Olmsted and his firm spent months establishing the precise geometric relationships between house, garden, and landscape that would produce the experience Vanderbilt required. The sense, from every principal room with a garden view, that the landscape was arranged around the house, as a frame is arranged around a painting, with the fountain serving as the visual anchor that held the composition together. From the library windows, the fountain was centered. From the loggia, the fountain was centered. The geometry was an argument about who occupied the center of the world being observed. Olmsted's correspondence reveals his private ambivalence about the formal garden commissions he accepted from Gilded Age clients. His mature landscape philosophy favored the naturalistic, The ecologically sensitive, the park designed for democratic public use. Central Park remains his most complete philosophical statement. Private estate work was, for his firm, remunerative, but philosophically complicated. The French formal garden tradition that most wealthy American clients preferred represented, in Olmsted's view, a fundamental misunderstanding of what landscape could accomplish. It substituted the display of geometric control for the more difficult art of making human beings feel genuinely restored by their environment. But the clients paying his fees had not commissioned philosophy, they had commissioned dominion. The practical infrastructure required to maintain a major Gilded Age formal garden exceeded, in many cases, the infrastructure of the house it served. Oheka Castle on Long Island, completed in 1917 for banker Otto Hermann Kahn, sits on 63 acres of landscaped grounds, designed by the French landscape architect Jacques Graber, in a formal Versailles-derived idiom. To maintain the water features, fountains, and reflecting pools that Graber's design required, Kahn constructed a dedicated reservoir and water tower system on the estate property. The water tower was itself a piece of architecture. Built in a Norman Revival style harmonizing with the chateau it served, but its function was purely utilitarian. And its existence illuminates the hidden infrastructure cost that formal garden design concealed beneath its apparent effortlessness. The garden's beauty was sustained by an engineering system that most American towns of the period lacked entirely. The seasonal labor required to maintain these landscapes was another invisible institutional operation. A major Newport or Long Island estate employed a head gardener, typically trained in England or Scotland, where the horticultural professions had developed formal educational curricula, who managed a permanent staff of 6 to 12 undergardeners and supplemented this corps with seasonal workers during planting and harvest periods. The head gardener's domain was, in physical terms, the largest on the estate, and his authority over it was nearly absolute. The garden's condition reflected directly on the household status, and social visitors were known to evaluate an estate's management as much by the state of its kitchen garden borders and its greenhouse plant collections as by the quality of its interior furnishings. The philosophical tension Olmsted identified was never resolved. The French formal garden on American soil was always a borrowed rhetoric, and the contradiction it embodied, European absolutist landscape aesthetics transplanted to a democratic republic, generated a kind of visual unease that the most successful American estate designers learned to manage by softening the geometry at the edges, allowing the formal core to dissolve gradually into naturalistic plantings and then into working landscape. The transition from ordered to wild was itself a social statement, that the family's domain was large enough to contain both civilization and nature, both the controlled and the untamed. To landscape 500 acres was to declare that nature itself operated within your property lines, and that even where you allowed it to appear wild, the wilderness itself was a designed effect, the product of enormous horticultural labor deployed to produce the appearance of ease. Henry Clay Frick gave his architect Thomas Hastings an instruction that was unusual, even by the standards of Gilded Age patrons accustomed to specifying their requirements with imperial directness. The house, Frick said, should be designed to become a museum. Not immediately, not during his lifetime, but the building's proportions, its circulation patterns, its room sequences and ceiling heights and natural light conditions should all be calculated with a public institutional afterlife in mind, so that when the time came, when Frick himself was gone and the provision in his will took effect, the conversion from private residence to public gallery would require minimum architectural intervention. He was commissioning simultaneously a home and a monument to the man who had lived in it. The staircase hall at 1 East 70th Street, completed in 1914, reflects this dual commission with unusual clarity. The proportions are those of a public building. The marble treads are wider than domestic use requires, sized for the steady flow of visitors moving in both directions simultaneously. The wrought iron balustrade is detailed with a formality and a finish quality that exceeds what a private household would commission. It was designed to be examined at close range by people with the leisure to examine it, people who had come not to live here but to look. The natural light admitted through the garden court skylight is calibrated to picture viewing conditions, not to the warm residential light that makes a room feel inhabited. Hastings was not building a home that happened to have a staircase. He was building a gallery sequence that happened, for the moment, to contain a resident. Frick's decision was rooted in a combination of temperament and strategy that was unusual among his peers. Most Gilded Age industrialists who commissioned great houses were engaged in a form of competitive social display calibrated to impress living contemporaries. Frick was, in addition to this, engaged in a longer competition, one with time itself, with the inevitable obsolescence of industrial fortunes, with the demonstrated fragility of family lines as stewards of cultural wealth. He had watched other men's collections dispersed at estate sales, their houses demolished for commercial development, their names forgotten within a generation of their deaths. His will was designed to prevent each of these outcomes. The collection would remain intact and in place, the building would be preserved by its institutional function, and the name attached to the address would be the name of the institution rather than a fading family memory. The art collection Frick assembled was, in architectural terms, the building's true structural system. Every room was proportioned to accommodate specific works he owned or intended to acquire. The living hall, with its dark oak paneling and relatively intimate scale, was designed around paintings that required close viewing distances and low ambient light. The West Gallery, the building's grandest interior, was sized to display large-format canvases at distances sufficient for the pictorial space within the painting to register fully. Frick consulted with dealers and with the directors of European museums about hanging heights and lighting conditions. He was not decorating a house. He was designing a building that would eventually be required to meet professional museum standards, and he intended to meet them in the original construction rather than through costly later renovation. The decision to build at 1 East 70th Street facing Central Park was itself part of the institutional logic. The location was the finest available on Fifth Avenue, visible, dignified, adjacent to the public park that gave the building a permanent open prospect no commercial development could obstruct. The house would face the park forever, and the park would give every visitor arriving on 70th Street the same composed approach that Frick had designed the entrance sequence to complete. He understood that a museum requires not only interior quality, but exterior address. That the institution begins at the street, before a visitor has passed through the gate, and that the choice of that street is itself an architectural decision of the first order. Frick had not built a house. He had built the argument that he deserved to be remembered, and he had built it in the only material that civic memory reliably respects. The financial architecture that sustained Gilded Age mansions was never as permanent as the limestone that clothed them. For decades, the great families had operated their estates as private kingdoms, paying wages, purchasing coal by the train car, replacing marble that cracked and silk that faded, without ever calculating the terminal arithmetic of their own extravagance. The reckoning, when it came, arrived not through a single catastrophe, but through the patient accumulation of legislative and economic forces that quietly redesigned the landscape of American wealth. The 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, authorized a federal income tax. The same year brought an estate tax capable of extracting significant portions of inherited fortunes before heirs could consolidate control. These were not immediately devastating instruments. Their early rates were modest, but they established a principle that would compound across decades with the inexorable logic of interest, A mansion that cost $2 million to build might cost $14,000 a year simply to maintain in idleness. When income was taxed and estates were taxed, and the servant class discovered it could earn comparable wages in factories freed by wartime labor demand, the economics of private palaces began their silent collapse. The human dimension of this collapse was traceable in specific families. Cornelius Vanderbilt III, inheriting properties that once represented the commanding heights of American domestic ambition, found himself managing not a legacy, but a liability. The household staff that had made invisible labor look effortless now commanded wages reflecting a post-war economy in which domestic service was no longer the only respectable employment available to working-class women and men. A butler in 1925 earned 3 times what his predecessor earned in 1900. A cook demanded comparable wages to a factory worker and retained the freedom to leave. The delicate human machinery that had operated the breakers and its peer estates, the parallel staircases, the invisible corridors, the synchronized choreography of meals and fires and flowers, required people willing to subordinate their lives to someone else's architectural theater, and those people were becoming scarcer and more expensive simultaneously. Estate managers began producing documentation that read less like household accounts and more like triage records, tracking which rooms could be shuttered, which wings could be closed, which functions could be consolidated without visibly diminishing the illusion of grandeur. The illusion grew more expensive to maintain precisely as the resources available to maintain it contracted. The 1925 announcement that the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue would be demolished was reported in the New York Herald Tribune as something close to a financial confession. The estate's carrying costs, taxes, maintenance, staffing, heating, the 1,000 invisible expenses of keeping dressed stone and gilded bronze from returning to their natural states of decay, had become unsustainable in a single generation. The commercial building that replaced it generated an annual revenue more than the estate consumed across a decade. This was not a sentimental calculation. It was arithmetic delivered without apology by a city that had always been fundamentally indifferent to the ambitions of those who tried to impose permanence upon it. The grand staircase, that recurring symbol of ascent, of social theater, of the choreographed descent into a ballroom full of witnesses, was now merely an obstacle. Its marble treads were expensive to preserve and impossible to repurpose in any subdivided commercial scheme. The same proportions that had been designed to make a woman in evening dress appear as though she were descending from somewhere more elevated than a second-floor dressing room were utterly useless to an office building. What had been architectural intention became architectural inconvenience. And inconvenience in New York has always had a short lifespan. The demolitions did not happen all at once, which in some ways made them more devastating than a single catastrophic loss would have been. They came steadily, one by one, across the 1920s and 30s and 40s, each announced with varying degrees of public notice and met with varying degrees of public indifference. A mansion that had consumed the labor of 1,000 craftsmen over 5 years could be reduced to rubble in 6 weeks. The arithmetic was efficient and merciless, and it operated without sentiment or ceremony because the city had already moved on to other ambitions. The economics were straightforward and brutal. The land beneath a Gilded Age estate on Fifth Avenue or along Newport's Bellevue Avenue had appreciated to a value that bore no rational relationship to the cost of maintaining the structure above it. Developers understood this with a clarity that preservationists, a class barely organized enough in the 1920s to constitute a movement, could not effectively counter. There was no federal preservation framework, no landmark designation process, no institutional mechanism for arguing that cultural loss carried economic standing equal to real estate profit. A building could be demolished because its owner chose to demolish it, and the choice was legal, financially rational, and almost entirely uncontested by any authority capable of enforcement. The human agents of demolition have been largely forgotten. which is itself a form of historical verdict. Someone signed each order. Someone hired each contractor. Someone stood in the room, perhaps the very ballroom where Alva Vanderbilt had forced Mrs. Astor's social capitulation through the sheer spectacle of architectural ambition, and decided that the room was worth more as rubble than as memory. These were not villains in any theatrical sense. They were heirs managing inherited obligations, accountants calculating carrying costs, and real estate investors applying logic that the original builders had never anticipated needing to resist. The mansion had been designed to intimidate rivals, not to survive indifference. Josephine Howell and the small community of advocates who recognized what was being lost were not powerless from ignorance. They were powerless from structural disadvantage, fighting a rearguard action with no legal weapons and no institutional backing. The preservation ethic that would eventually produce landmark laws, historic district designations, and the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 was still assembling its philosophical foundations, while the wrecking crews were already dismantling cornice by cornice, balustrade by balustrade. Argument and sentiment could not compete with a demolition permit and a contractor's schedule already committed to the work. By the time the legal and cultural infrastructure for preservation existed, most of what needed preserving was already gone. The 1946 Newport Mercury editorial lamenting the passing of the cottage era was elegiac, not because the loss was recent, but because the writer understood it had been accumulating for 2 decades and was now, essentially, complete. The cottages, a characteristically modest euphemism for structures that contained 40 rooms and required 40 servants, had not fallen dramatically. They had simply been sold, neglected, subdivided, and finally signed over to developers who saw no distinction between a Renaissance ballroom ceiling and any other square footage awaiting a more profitable configuration. What the demolitions revealed, in retrospect, was something the Gilded Age families had always refused to acknowledge. Their mansions had never truly belonged to the permanence they claimed. A palace inherited across generations develops the patina of inevitability, acquiring the weight of continuous occupation, the sense that it has always existed and will continue to exist because existence itself is its nature. A palace built within a single decade by a single generation of new money carries no such weight. It carries only the intention of permanence, which is a different and considerably more fragile thing, dependent entirely on the willingness of successors to honor an ambition they did not originate. The photographers arrived before the demolition crews, which was itself an admission that the end had already been accepted. Estate inventory photographers composed the same shots that society photographers had composed decades earlier for fashion publications and architectural journals. The grand staircase framed from the entrance hall below, marble treads ascending toward the landing, the proportions unchanged, the light falling exactly as it always had, but the purpose of the image had been transformed entirely. Where once the photograph declared arrival and dominance, it now performed something closer to last rites, preserving in silver gelatin what stone and mortar could no longer hold. Without purpose, the staircase was simply an expensive arrangement of material, awaiting reclassification as debris. The marble was exactly as it had always been. The proportions were unchanged. The craftsmanship that had required imported artisans and years of patient labor remained visible in every carved detail. Only the animating intention had been removed, and intention, it turned out, was the structural element that no architect had thought to specify, and no building code had ever required. When it was gone, everything else followed, not with violence, but with the quiet, methodical efficiency of a city that had already decided what came next, and had no particular reason to mourn what had come before. What survives of the Gilded Age mansions today exists largely because someone with a camera stood in the right room before the wrecking crews arrived. The Byron Company, operating from the 1880s through the 1940s, accumulated an archive of approximately 30,000 photographs of New York interiors, commissioned originally for social publications, for family records, for the documentation of entertaining seasons and domestic arrangements that the families themselves considered worth preserving. Percy Byron and his colleagues were not architectural historians. They were commercial photographers responding to client demand, moving through rooms filled with flowers and silver and carefully arranged evidence of cultivation, setting up their equipment, and making exposures that recorded the surfaces of wealth with the clinical thoroughness that the era's photographic technology permitted. They were not conscious of producing an irreplaceable record. They were conscious of producing an invoice. The archive they left behind is now held at the Museum of the City of New York and constitutes the most complete visual record of interiors that no longer physically exist. Architectural drawings survive in some cases. Written descriptions survive in newspapers and social columns and the occasional memoir. But the photograph operates differently from these other records. It preserves spatial relationships, light quality, the precise arrangement of objects in rooms, the way a staircase railing caught reflections, the scale of a doorway relative to the human figure posed beside it for proportion. The Detroit Publishing Company's glass plate negatives, preserved partly through the intervention of the Library of Congress, provide comparable documentation for estates beyond New York. Together, these archives constitute a ghost architecture, a set of spaces that exist in two dimensions with a specificity that sometimes exceeds what survives in three. The recurring motif of the grand staircase appears in these photographs with a frequency that suggests the photographers understood, consciously or not, that they were recording something central. Nearly every documented interior includes at least one image taken from the foot of the main stair looking upward, or from a landing looking down into the entrance hall. The compositional logic was partly practical. Staircases offered dramatic vertical lines, interesting light from above, and the natural suggestion of depth that flat rooms resisted. But the consistency of the framing across different photographers, different estates, and different decades implies something beyond technique. The staircase was where the house declared itself. It was where the proportions converged, where the materials were most concentrated, where the intention of the architecture was most legible. To photograph the staircase was to photograph the argument the building was making about its owner. The most complete record of the Vanderbilt mansion's interior survives not in any architectural archive, but in a commercial portrait photographer's portfolio. Images taken to document a social season that have outlasted the season, the mansion, and most of the family by a century. The philosophical weight of this inversion is considerable. The families built in marble because marble was supposed to endure. Stone was chosen over wood, bronze over iron, because durability was itself a statement, a refusal of the impermanence that haunted new money, an insistence that what had been assembled could not be disassembled. And yet it was disassembled, in most cases within a single human lifetime. What endured was light on silver gelatin, a chemical process, commercially motivated, technically imperfect by modern standards, and entirely accidental in its preservation function. The photograph is the ruin. When the stone is gone, the image becomes the only material that carries forward the spatial memory of what the stone once organized. The grand staircases of the Gilded Age are now photographs of grand staircases. The descent that once organized social life now organizes a filing system. The marble treads exist in two dimensions in an archive in a city that built taller and denser and more profitable structures on the ground where the originals once stood. The estates that survived the 20th century did so not through inevitability, but through accident, geography, and in rare cases, the extraordinary foresight of a single individual. Biltmore endured because George Vanderbilt's descendants recognized that the estate's sheer scale made private maintenance impossible and public revenue necessary. When Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil opened the grounds to paying visitors in 1948, the announcement carried the language of economic pragmatism, not cultural stewardship. The press release spoke of operating costs and employment figures, not of architectural heritage. Yet the result was preservation of the most complete surviving example of Gilded Age residential ambition anywhere on American soil. Newport's survival followed a different logic. The Preservation Society of Newport County, established in 1945, stepped into the vacuum left by departing families who could no longer sustain seasonal occupation of 70-room houses. The breakers, transferred to institutional stewardship, became something its original owners never intended: a democratic monument. The grand staircase that once carried Cornelius Vanderbilt II and his guests now carries thousands of visitors each week, their footsteps wearing the same marble treads that witnessed the full arc of Gilded Age ambition. There is a particular quality to that worn marble, not tragic exactly, but honest. It records use without discrimination. The Frick collection represents the third model of survival: premeditated institutional transformation. Henry Clay Frick designed his Fifth Avenue mansion knowing it would cease to be a home at his death, its rooms reconfigured for public contemplation of the art he spent a lifetime acquiring. The staircase hall proportions, which always seemed oversized for domestic use, now make perfect sense as a transitional space between gallery rooms. Every surviving Gilded Age mansion operates today as an institution rather than a residence. The paradox is precise. Only by ceasing to be private could private grandeur endure. The housing form that Gilded Age elites spent decades, fortunes, and extraordinary architectural energy refusing ultimately prevailed on every street where they had staked their territorial claims. Fifth Avenue, the boulevard that William Henry Vanderbilt and his contemporaries lined with limestone declarations of anti-apartment permanence, is now defined by exactly the residential towers and luxury cooperative buildings their generation found philosophically intolerable. Buildings like 740 Park Avenue and 15 Central Park West carry today the precise social weight that Vanderbilt mansions once carried. Their addresses functioning as credentials, their lobbies performing the same theater of exclusion that private ballrooms once staged. Architectural historian Robert A. M. Stern documented this transition with careful precision, tracing how the cooperative apartment absorbed the grammar of the mansion: the grand entrance, the vertical procession, the careful management of who was admitted and who was not. The lobby chandelier replaced the carriage court. The private elevator replaced the grand staircase. The doorman replaced the butler. What the Gilded Age elite genuinely could not have anticipated was not the apartment building's rise, but the degree to which it would faithfully replicate their own social logic in compressed vertical form. The families who once refused to share walls with neighbors now pay extraordinary premiums to occupy buildings where the neighbor above and below may be equally prominent. What changed was not the appetite for exclusion, but the architectural container in which that appetite was satisfied. The mansion required acres. The luxury cooperative required only the right address and a sufficiently intimidating board approval process. In this compression, the Gilded Age mansion was not defeated. It was distilled. The hunger for architectural declaration survived the stone perfectly intact, miniaturized into lobbies that gesture toward grandeur without ever quite achieving its original, ruinous, magnificent scale.